Eli Harper had always been a man of the land, his life tied to the rolling hills, the endless stretches of prairie, and the stubborn cattle that wandered his ranch. But unlike the cattle, Eli had drifted from human companionship. The small town nearby often whispered about the lonely rancher, the man who barely spoke to anyone and had no family to speak of. Rumors swirled. Some said he had been betrayed by business partners, others claimed heartbreak had driven him away from society. Whatever the truth, Eli lived by one rule: trust no one. The morning air was crisp and biting, carrying with it the scent of frost and pine. Eli saddled his old horse, Rust, and adjusted the wide brim of his hat. The ranch sprawled over hundreds of acres, dotted with weathered fences and the occasional barn that creaked with the wind. To an outsider, it might seem empty, barren even, but to Eli, every corner of that land was familiar, each stone and hollowed tree a part of his silent companionship. Rust nickered softly as they began their routine inspection of the cattle, and Eli muttered a wordless reply, his voice roughened by years of disuse. Loneliness wasn't something Eli mourned. It had become a shield. He spoke more to Rust and the cattle than he did to people. Sometimes, when the wind whistled through the fences at night, Eli imagined conversations with his late father, with friends long gone, or even strangers he had known briefly. But those were fleeting fantasies, reminders of a world he had left behind, deliberately or not. Inside the ranch house, the small hearth glowed faintly, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. The furniture was sparse, practical, and worn, much like the man who lived there. On the mantel rested a few photographs faded, edges curled, faces smiling long ago. They were the only hints of a life that had once been filled with laughter and connection. Eli rarely glanced at them. They were painful memories best left undisturbed. The dog, a scruffy mutt named Patch, was the closest thing Eli allowed himself to call family. Patch would sit by the hearth, eyes following Eli's every move, a silent witness to the routine of solitude. Eli's days were structured, almost ritualistic. Before dawn, he inspected the fences, ensuring no gaps could let the cattle wander off. By mid-morning, he rode through the pastures, checking on the herds and repairing gates that had succumbed to winter frost or the careless hooves of the animals. He worked without complaint, his body hardened by years of labor, his hands scarred and calloused. Meals were simple: beans, bread, and occasionally a rabbit or deer he had hunted himself. He ate quickly, alone, listening only to the crackle of the fire or the distant howl of wolves. Despite his isolation, Eli observed the town from afar. He could see the smoke from chimneys rising in the winter air, the flicker of lanterns in windows, the bustle of families preparing for the cold months. There was a warmth in their connections that Eli had long abandoned, but he didn't mourn it. He had convinced himself that he preferred the quiet, the certainty of solitude over the unpredictability of people. Yet, in the back of his mind, a subtle restlessness lingered, an itch he refused to name. It was not loneliness in the ordinary sense, nor was it longing for companionship. It was a small, persistent echo of something missing, something he had buried deep when life had taught him that opening his heart could lead to pain. For now, he buried it under chores, under routine, under the endless horizon of prairie that stretched endlessly before him. Eli Harper, the lonely rancher, was a man defined by the land, by the silence, and by the cautious walls he had built around himself. But fate, as it often does, had a way of breaking even the strongest walls, and his quiet life was about to intersect with a family whose struggle would challenge the very foundations of his solitude. Winter arrived early that year, faster and harsher than anyone in the small town had expected. The sky seemed permanently gray, heavy with clouds that threatened snow at every hour. The wind blew relentlessly across the prairie, cutting through layers of clothing like a blade. On the outskirts of town, where the roads were little more than rutted paths, life became a daily struggle for survival. The cold was not just an inconvenience, it was a threat, a force that could claim both livestock and life if one were unprepared. Among the town's residents was the Miller family. The mother, Clara, was a widow, her husband having succumbed to illness the previous spring. Her children, little Samuel and his younger sister Lily, were the center of her world, but providing for them during this merciless winter was a near impossible task. Their small cabin, barely insulated and with a sagging roof, offered little protection against the biting winds that seemed to howl through the cracks in the walls. Smoke from their meager fire curled weakly into the air, a fragile attempt to stave off the chill. The day had begun like any other. Clara bundled her children in layers of worn clothing and sent them outside to fetch wood, ration water, and search for any scraps of food they could manage. Samuel, clutching a small bundle of bread they had saved over the week, carefully balanced it in his hands as he led Lily along the snow-dusted path. The snow crunched under their boots, each step sending tiny flurries into the air. Clara watched from the cabin door, anxiety etched into her face. She knew the dangers, the possibility of frostbite, of wandering too far, of losing the little they had worked so hard to gather. The family's daily meal was a ritual of patience and gratitude. They boiled what little water they could spare, cooked the bread slowly over the fire, and divided it into portions small enough to last for the day. Samuel and Lily sat cross-legged on the cabin floor, their eyes wide with anticipation, yet tempered by the understanding that this simple meal was all they could afford. The winter had stripped away any illusions of abundance. Every morsel mattered, every crumb was precious. Outside, the town itself was struggling. Shops were closed earlier than usual, roads were impassable for wagons, and families huddled together, sharing warmth and rationing supplies. Eli Harper, the lonely rancher, rode past on his horse, observing the snow-covered rooftops and smoke rising from chimneys. He noticed how different his life was from those in the town. While his ranch provided him with some security, the townsfolk and families like the Millers faced daily uncertainty. Their survival depended on weather, luck, and the little they could manage to scavenge or hunt. Despite the harshness of the season, life persisted. Samuel and Lily trudged back with small bundles of firewood and scraps of food. Clara carefully distributed the supplies, teaching her children how to be mindful of their resources. The wind rattled the cabin walls, a constant reminder of the vulnerability of their existence. Every small success, a saved loaf of bread, a handful of dry wood felt like a victory against the relentless cold. Yet the family faced more than just nature's cruelty. Hunger gnawed at them, and the scarcity of resources weighed heavily on Clara's mind. She worried constantly, calculating how long their food could last, how to stretch the firewood, how to protect her children from the cold that seemed to seep into every corner of their lives. Her resilience was remarkable, but the strain was visible in her tired eyes and the crease of her forehead. As the sun dipped behind the gray horizon, casting long shadows over the snow-covered land, Samuel held the bread tightly. The day's efforts had yielded a small reward, but it was fragile and temporary. The family huddled together for warmth, their breath misting in the cold air, each lost in their thoughts. Outside, the wind howled, a relentless force that neither begged nor waited. Inside, the Millers faced the winter with courage and determination, clinging to hope and the small victories of the day. Little did they know, a figure watched from the edge of town Eli Harper, the lonely rancher. His presence was silent, unnoticed, but his awareness of their struggle planted the seed of something long dormant: empathy, and perhaps a path toward connection that neither he nor the family could yet foresee. The wind had turned sharper by mid-afternoon, slicing through coats and hats as if to remind everyone that winter would not relent. Eli Harper rode along the outskirts of the town, inspecting fences and checking on his horse, Rust, who had been restless in the cold. His eyes, usually fixed on the horizon or the line of cattle, caught movement near the Miller cabin. At first, he intended to ride past, uninterested in the struggles of townsfolk who, in his mind, had always been too dependent or careless. But something about the scene stopped him. The little boy Samuel stood cautiously near the edge of the cabin, clutching a small bundle of bread. His sister Lily huddled behind him, shivering. The two children's eyes were wide, wary, yet curious. Eli slowed his horse and observed quietly from a distance. There was an air of desperation, yes, but also a resolve that Eli hadn't seen in children before. Samuel's small hands were red from the cold, his fingers gripping the precious bundle as if it were a lifeline, which in truth it was. For a moment, Eli considered riding on, maintaining his usual detachment. He reminded himself that he had enough to survive, that the hardships of others were not his concern. Yet something tugged at him, a flicker of unease, of discomfort at witnessing such vulnerability so close. And then he heard it, the voice of the boy, timid but firm. "Please, don't take our food," Samuel said, his voice barely above the whisper of the wind. "We saved all day for this." Eli's hand tightened on the reins, and a strange sensation passed through him. The plea was simple, unassuming, yet it carried a weight he hadn't expected. It wasn't just a request. It was trust, bravery, and hope all bundled into a few fragile words. He realized with an unsettling clarity that he hadn't been spoken to like this in years. Nobody had asked for his help, nor had anyone dared to expose their vulnerability in his presence. And yet, here was this little boy looking him in the eye, daring to believe that Eli Harper might be more than the solitary figure the town whispered about. Eli's first instinct was to tighten his guard, to look away and ride off before his emotions betrayed him. But he stayed, frozen by a mixture of curiosity and an unfamiliar sense of responsibility. Samuel's gaze was steady, almost pleading, and Lily peeked out from behind her brother, shivering but trusting that he knew what to do. The boy's words echoed in Eli's mind long after the wind carried them away. "We saved all day for this." He imagined the painstaking effort it must have taken walking in the snow, rationing what little food they had, braving the cold to gather enough to last the day. The idea that someone so small could display such determination stirred something in Eli that he had long thought buried. Empathy, compassion, a connection to life beyond himself. For the first time in years, Eli felt conflicted. He thought of his own supplies, stored carefully for months, untouched and safe. Sharing them would be easy in theory, yet it required exposing himself, breaking a self-imposed rule of solitude. And yet, he couldn't shake the boy's plea from his mind. It was as if Samuel's voice had breached the walls Eli had built around his heart, leaving a small crack that light and perhaps warmth could enter through. After a long pause, Eli adjusted his grip on the reins, his decision forming quietly but resolutely. He wouldn't take the bread, not today, not ever. The boy's plea had anchored a silent promise in him. He would not harm them. Not now, not ever. And though he didn't yet know how, he felt the first tentative stirrings of action, an acknowledgement that his life, so rigid and solitary, might now intersect with theirs in ways that could change both. As he rode past, careful not to startle the children, Eli cast a glance over his shoulder. Samuel and Lily were watching him, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and hope. For Eli, it was a small moment, but for them, it was a first test of trust. And in that fleeting exchange, the foundations of an unlikely connection were laid, one that would gradually transform a lonely rancher and a struggling family alike. That night, Eli Harper sat alone in his small cabin, the fire crackling faintly in the hearth. The cold outside was relentless, but it was nothing compared to the storm brewing in his mind. Samuel's plea, so simple, so unassuming, replayed over and over, echoing in the quiet corners of a heart that had grown hardened over decades of solitude. "Please, don't take our food. We saved all day for this." The words clung to him, haunting the silence he had cultivated for so long. Eli had always believed that his isolation was a shield, a necessary defense against disappointment, betrayal, and loss. Over the years, he had built walls around himself so high and so sturdy that he could survive the harshness of life without relying on anyone. He had convinced himself that people were unpredictable, weak, and often selfish. And yet, in the face of Samuel's courage, those walls felt suddenly fragile. He thought back to his past, to the reasons he had withdrawn from society. A friend who had cheated him out of a small fortune in cattle sales. A woman he had loved whose affection vanished when life became difficult. Even family had turned their backs on him at critical moments. These memories had left scars, both visible and invisible, and they had shaped the man he was today, cautious, self-reliant, and wary of trust. But now, sitting by the fire, Eli realized that his past rules didn't apply here, or at least, they felt strangely incomplete. The boy's trust had not been earned through calculation or negotiation. It had been given freely, bravely, and without expectation. Samuel had exposed his family's vulnerability, relying on the kindness of a stranger, and in doing so, he had challenged Eli's long-held beliefs about human nature. Eli wrestled with conflicting impulses. Part of him wanted to ride back to the cabin, leave a sack of food on the doorstep, and disappear before being noticed, a quiet act that would fulfill his compassion without exposing himself. Another part of him resisted, reminding himself that he was not responsible for anyone else, that attachment only led to pain. Yet, the more he thought about it, the more absurd that rationale felt. He had spent years protecting himself from imagined harm, but he realized he had also insulated himself from the very experiences that made life meaningful: connection, empathy, and purpose. Sleep came fitfully that night. Dreams were fragmented, filled with images of the boy and his sister, of their meager cabin against the merciless snow, and of the bread Samuel had clutched so tightly. Eli awoke in the pre-dawn hours with a sense of unease he hadn't felt in years. A gnawing realization that ignoring the boy's plea was no longer a morally or emotionally comfortable choice. By morning, Eli had made a tentative decision. He would act, but cautiously. He would observe first, offering help in ways that would not compromise his own safety or independence. Perhaps he could leave supplies where the family could find them, or mend a broken fence, or guide them in ways that would make survival easier. He would not intrude into their lives unnecessarily, but he would no longer stand idly by while they struggled. As he saddled Rust and prepared to ride, Eli felt an unfamiliar stirring, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and even excitement. For the first time in decades, the walls he had built around his heart seemed permeable, allowing a glimpse of the possibilities that lay beyond solitude. Compassion was no longer a distant concept, but a tangible force pushing him toward action. Eli's inner conflict had shifted from a debate about trust to a question of identity. Could he allow himself to care again? Could he risk connection when it might bring pain, or even disappointment? The answers were not yet clear, but one thing was certain. Samuel's plea had cracked the armor of his loneliness, and Eli Harper would never see the world or himself the same way again. Eli Harper didn't take the decision lightly. For years he had lived by strict rules. Keep your distance, trust no one, rely only on yourself. Yet the image of Samuel, small hands clutching the precious bread, haunted him. That boy's courage and innocence had pierced a wall Eli had thought unbreakable. It was time to act, but he knew he had to do so carefully, without forcing himself into the family's life or exposing his vulnerabilities too soon. He saddled Rust before dawn, the frost glittering on the horse's coat like diamonds in the pale morning light. Eli carried no bundle of gifts or food. Instead, he relied on stealth and observation. He had noticed how the family struggled with their firewood, how the roof sagged under the weight of winter snow, and how small their stored provisions were. His plan was simple: leave help in ways that would not startle or embarrass them. He would be the shadow that eased their burdens without being seen, the invisible hand guiding them through a merciless season. The first stop was the cabin. Eli dismounted silently, carrying a small stack of firewood. He placed it near the back door, just enough to supplement what the family had gathered. Samuel and Lily were inside, and Clara was tending to the fire. They didn't see him, and that was exactly how he wanted it. He lingered for a moment, observing their simple routine, the careful rationing of water, the division of a meager meal, the quiet exchanges of affection that warmed the room even in the bitter cold. He realized that small gestures could mean the difference between hope and despair in this household. After the wood, Eli moved to the fence surrounding their small garden. It had been damaged by the winter storms, and any intrusion by wild animals would destroy what little food the family had managed to grow. He repaired the fence as quickly and quietly as he could, hammering posts into the frozen earth and tightening the wires. Sweat ran down his brow despite the freezing air, but he didn't care. Each repair was a promise, silent yet sincere, that someone was watching over them. Over the next several days, Eli repeated these small acts of assistance. A sack of grain placed near the cabin's side entrance, a bundle of blankets left under a tree, subtle repairs to the roof. Always unseen, always careful to avoid being caught. He wanted to help without imposing, to bridge the gap between his solitude and their need with discretion. Yet with each act, he felt something stirring within himself, a warmth, a quiet satisfaction that wasn't tied to survival or practicality, but to connection, to the knowledge that his actions mattered. The family began to notice, though they never saw the benefactor. Samuel whispered to his mother about the extra firewood, the new blankets, the subtle repairs that seemed almost magical. Clara shook her head, puzzled yet grateful, sensing a kindness they couldn't explain. The children speculated about a winter guardian, a mysterious figure who cared enough to intervene without asking for anything in return. Eli smiled privately to himself whenever he heard these whispers. The anonymity allowed him to help without fear, but he also realized that the boy's plea had awakened a part of him that longed for genuine connection. Eli's internal struggle continued. Part of him wanted to remain hidden forever, content to aid the family without revealing himself. Another part, though, wondered if the family, especially Samuel, might need him in a more direct way. He was slowly learning that true compassion required risk, that helping someone in need sometimes meant allowing oneself to be seen, to be vulnerable. Yet the thought of stepping into their lives directly still frightened him. By the end of the week, Eli knew he could not ignore the growing bond he felt. Samuel's bravery, his mother's quiet strength, and the little sister's innocent trust were reshaping the contours of Eli's heart. The wall around his life had been breached, not by force, but by a boy who simply asked, with courage and honesty, for mercy and understanding. Eli Harper, the lonely rancher, had taken the first step into a new kind of life, one where empathy might finally outweigh fear. The days that followed marked the beginning of a subtle but profound transformation in Eli Harper as life. He continued his quiet acts of assistance, leaving supplies and fixing what the family could not manage, but something unexpected began to happen. The children noticed him. Not in full, startling presence, but in fleeting glimpses, a shadow moving along the tree line, the glint of a horse in the distance, the soft clatter of tools from a repaired fence. Samuel, perceptive and brave beyond his years, began to sense that their mysterious winter guardian was no mere imagination. One afternoon, Samuel ventured a little closer to the edge of the forest as he collected firewood, his small hands gripping the axe his mother had lent him. He froze when he spotted Eli sitting on rust, quietly repairing a section of the broken fence. Their eyes met across the snow-covered expanse. Eli's instinct screamed to retreat, to remain hidden, to preserve the comfort of anonymity, but something in Samuel's gaze stayed him. There was no fear, only curiosity and trust, the kind of trust that Eli had long thought impossible to earn. Are you helping us?" Samuel asked, his voice tentative. Eli's mouth went dry. Words had not been part of his carefully constructed life for years. He hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, whether honesty would be safe or too dangerous. Finally, he nodded once slowly. "I've been fixing what I can," he said, his voice low but steady. Samuel's face lit up, a mix of relief and excitement. "Thank you," he whispered, though Eli had not expected thanks. It was not necessary. The boy's recognition alone was enough to stir warmth in a heart long cold. Over the following days, the encounters became more frequent. Samuel and Lily left small tokens for Eli, drawings in the snow, a tiny bundle of berries, even a scarf that had become too small for Lily. These gestures were small, but to Eli they were monumental. They represented a bridge being built, plank by fragile plank, between his world of solitude and the family's world of survival and hope. Clara, observing from the cabin, noted the change as well. She saw the softening in Eli's demeanor, even in those brief, careful interactions. She never intruded, understanding that trust could not be forced. She simply watched, silently grateful for a kindness that seemed almost miraculous in its quiet consistency. The children began to share moments with Eli beyond necessity. Samuel asked questions about the land, the cattle, and even Rust, eager to learn from the man whose presence had become a quiet reassurance. Eli, at first cautious, began to answer, finding a strange joy in passing down knowledge. He showed Samuel how to mend fences, how to track footprints in the snow, how to identify signs of animals in the fields. Each lesson was small, practical, yet it carried a deeper significance. Eli was investing himself, opening himself, and discovering the subtle reward of connection. Lily, shy at first, warmed to him slowly, offering shy smiles and tentative waves. When she fell behind during a walk to gather firewood, Eli would wait, patiently guiding her back with gentle words. The trust she began to place in him was unlike anything he had experienced. It demanded patience, consistency, and empathy. And for the first time in decades, Eli realized that giving these things did not weaken him. It strengthened him, grounding his life in purpose beyond mere survival. By the end of the week, Eli felt a shift in his own heart. The loneliness that had defined him for so long no longer seemed insurmountable. Small acts of kindness, glimpses of trust, and the laughter of children in the snow began to fill spaces he had long thought empty. He understood that connection was not a danger to be avoided, but a gift to be embraced cautiously, yet wholeheartedly. Eli Harper, once the lonely rancher who had avoided the world, was beginning to understand the quiet power of trust, compassion, and the bonds that can form even between strangers. The seeds of an unlikely friendship had been planted, and nurtured with care. They promised to grow into something life-changing for both him and the Miller family. Winter's grip tightened over the prairie, bringing with it more than cold and isolation. Snow fell in heavy, relentless sheets, blanketing the landscape in white and making travel nearly impossible. The town's roads vanished under drifts, and the howling wind carried warnings that survival would not come easily. For the Miller family, every day was a challenge. But now danger took a new form, an external threat that would test both their courage and the quiet presence that Eli Harper had become in their lives. It began subtly. Tracks appeared near the cabin larger than any animal that roamed the area. Clara noticed items missing from the small garden, scraps of food disturbed or disappearing overnight. At first, she attributed it to wild animals, perhaps a hungry fox or raccoon desperate to survive. But then the sound came, footsteps in the snow that were too deliberate, too heavy to be anything natural. Something or someone was approaching. L.A. had been observing the family from the ridge above, his instincts sharpened by years alone on the ranch. When he saw the tracks, his heart clenched. The thought of strangers intruding into the Miller cabin filled him with unease he hadn't felt in years. He realized immediately that passive help would not suffice this time. He needed to act decisively. As night fell, the threat became clearer. Shadows moved near the edge of the forest, and a harsh wind carried muffled voices, rough and demanding. Eli recognized the danger. Desperate men, likely seeking food or shelter, drawn by the harsh winter and the sight of an isolated cabin with supplies. He knew the family could not defend themselves. Samuel and Lily were too small, and Clara had little strength to fight off anyone who intended harm. Eli's mind raced. For years he had avoided such entanglements, hiding behind solitude and self-reliance. But the family had unknowingly claimed a piece of his heart, and he could not allow them to be threatened. He prepared quickly, gathering tools that could serve as improvised weapons, checking Rust's readiness, and mentally mapping the landscape between the forest and the cabin. Every instinct honed by years on the ranch tracking, observation, and patience now became a weapon against the imminent danger. That night, he descended from the ridge quietly, positioning himself between the intruders and the cabin. The shadows grew closer, voices more distinct. Eli's hand rested on his rifle, but he hoped he would not need to use it. He preferred deterrence, stealth, and intimidation over violence. The first figure emerged from the tree line, lantern swinging, and Eli's voice, calm but commanding, cut through the wind. "Stay back," he called, his presence sudden and imposing. The figure froze, eyes widening. Eli had stepped into the snow, framed by Rust's massive form, the rifle leveled not in anger, but in unwavering resolve. The others hesitated, unsure who this silent, formidable figure was, and why he would risk himself for a family they did not know. The standoff was tense, but Eli's presence was enough. Slowly, the intruders retreated, muttering curses into the wind. They had underestimated the man they thought would be an easy target, a solitary rancher with little care for anyone. Eli watched until they vanished into the forest. Ensuring the family was safe before finally allowing himself a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. Back at the cabin, Clara, Samuel, and Lily had witnessed nothing of the confrontation directly, but they sensed the shift. Eli's decisive intervention had kept them safe, and they would never forget it. For Eli, it was more than a successful defense, it was a revelation. Protecting others, stepping into danger for the sake of someone else, had awoken a courage he had thought long buried. That night, as he returned to his own cabin, Eli felt a new sense of purpose. The walls around his heart had been breached not by words or gifts alone, but by trust, vulnerability, and the need for protection. He understood that life was no longer about isolation, it was about connection, responsibility, and the quiet heroism that could arise from care and courage. The following morning dawned clear and bright, but the memory of the previous night's danger lingered in Eli Harper's mind like a shadow he could not shake. The intruders had vanished, but he knew the prairie was full of threats, hungry men, wild animals, and the relentless cold. Yet, for the first time, Eli felt a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. Protecting the Miller family had awoken something long dormant, courage fueled not by fear, but by care. Samuel and Lily were outside, collecting firewood in small bundles, while Clara tended the weak fire inside. Eli watched from a distance, the winter sunlight glinting off the snow, illuminating their struggle against the harsh elements. He could see how vulnerable they were, how easily the cold or another threat could overwhelm them. And he knew he could not remain a silent observer any longer. As he approached the cabin this time, Eli made his presence known. Rust's hooves crunched in the snow, drawing the children's attention. Samuel's eyes widened in recognition and awe, and Lily clutched her brother's arm instinctively. Eli dismounted carefully, speaking in a calm, reassuring tone. "Stay close. Don't wander too far today." His voice carried authority, but also warmth, something the family had not yet fully associated with his solitary figure. The day brought its own challenges. A sudden winter storm descended upon the area, heavier than anyone could have anticipated. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, and the wind threatened to topple the fragile structure of the Miller cabin. Firewood was damp, the roof sagging dangerously, and the children shivered uncontrollably. Clara tried to manage, but the storm's force was overwhelming. Eli acted without hesitation. He guided Samuel and Lily inside, wrapping them in blankets and checking them for signs of frostbite. Then, braving the storm, he worked on reinforcing the cabin. The roof needed urgent repair, and the weak walls required shoring up. Eli moved quickly, using every skill he had learned over decades of ranching and surviving the wilderness. Snow clung to his coat, whipped into his face by the howling wind, but he ignored the discomfort. There was no thought of self-preservation. Only the children's safety mattered. At one point, a gust of wind tore a section of the cabin wall loose, sending debris scattering dangerously close to Samuel. Without thinking, Eli leapt forward, blocking the child from harm and steadying the crumbling structure with his hands. His coat was drenched, his hands raw from the cold and the effort, but the danger passed. Samuel stared at him, wide-eyed, understanding for the first time the depth of Eli's courage. By nightfall, the storm had passed, leaving a fresh, sparkling blanket of snow over the land. The cabin, though battered, had survived, thanks to Eli's tireless intervention. The children were safe, warm, and fed, and Clara, exhausted but grateful, could barely find words to express her appreciation. She simply placed a hand on Eli's arm, a quiet gesture that spoke volumes: trust, gratitude, and recognition of the man who had stepped into their lives and into the storm to protect them. For Eli, the experience was transformative. He realized that true heroism was not in solitude, in isolation, or in guarding oneself from the world. Heroism was in acts of care, in stepping into danger for the sake of others, and in allowing oneself to be vulnerable. The family's trust had given him a new purpose, and he felt a connection that was no longer theoretical but tangible, something he could see, touch, and protect. As he settled in near the fire that night, exhausted but quietly triumphant, Eli understood something profound. The lonely rancher who had avoided people for so long had discovered that his life and the lives of others could be richer and fuller when courage was paired with compassion. For the first time in years, Eli Harper felt truly alive, not just surviving, but living, connected to a family who had opened his heart through need, trust, and innocence. The morning after the storm, the world seemed transformed. Snow blanketed the prairie in pristine white, glistening under a pale winter sun, and for the first time in weeks, there was a sense of calm and relief in the Miller cabin. Eli Harper, the once lonely rancher, sat nearby, quietly observing the family he had come to care for. There was no longer a barrier of distance or fear between them. The events of the past days had forged a bond that neither time nor hardship could easily sever. Clara moved about the cabin, tending to chores with a newfound lightness in her step. The fear and anxiety that had weighed so heavily on her shoulders now shared space with gratitude, trust, and even a cautious sense of hope. She glanced at Eli, noting the quiet strength and care he exuded, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time: reassurance. In him, she saw not just a protector, but a man capable of compassion, a man who had risked himself without hesitation for her children. Samuel, emboldened by the events, approached Eli with a small, shy smile. "Thank you," he said simply, yet the weight of those words carried more than any elaborate declaration. They reflected the deep trust he had placed in Eli, the recognition of bravery and kindness, and the bond that had begun to form between them. Lily, usually reserved and timid, pressed close to her brother and offered Eli a tentative smile, one that said more than words could convey. She trusted him, and in her innocence she had no doubts about his intentions. Eli felt something swell in his chest, a mixture of relief, pride, and a quiet happiness he had not experienced in decades. He realized that for the first time, his actions had created a meaningful impact beyond mere survival. Protecting the family had given him purpose. Witnessing their gratitude and trust had awakened emotions long dormant within him. For years, Eli had measured life in terms of distance, solitude, and self-preservation. Now he measured it in connection, courage, and care. The afternoon was spent in quiet companionship. Samuel asked questions about the ranch and the land, eager to understand the world that had shaped Eli. Lily joined in, her curiosity brightening the room as she listened to stories of the prairie, rust, and the many small lessons Eli had learned over a lifetime. Clara watched them, a soft smile on her face, silently acknowledging that the children had found a mentor, a friend, and a protector in the man she had once regarded only as a distant figure on the horizon. As the evening drew near, Eli prepared a modest meal for the family. The act of sharing food, once a solitary ritual for him, now carried a sense of communion, of belonging. They ate together, not as strangers or bystanders, but as a unit bound by mutual respect, gratitude, and care. The warmth of the fire mirrored the warmth spreading quietly through Eli's heart, filling spaces that had long been hollowed out by years of isolation and self-reliance. When night fell and the children were tucked into bed, Clara approached Eli. "We don't know how to thank you," she said softly, her eyes reflecting both relief and admiration. Eli shook his head, a small, almost shy smile on his face. "You don't need to," he replied. "Just take care of each other. That's enough for me." But he knew, deep down, that their presence in his life was also enough for him. The quiet, simple acts of trust and courage from the family had given him a gift he had long thought impossible: connection. Eli Harper, the lonely rancher, had transformed. The bond forged through trust, courage, and compassion had dissolved the walls he had built around himself. He understood now that life was richer when shared, that vulnerability could coexist with strength, and that love and care were not weaknesses, but sources of resilience. The family he had protected was no longer simply people he aided from afar. They had become his reason to act as companions in a harsh and unpredictable world, and the embodiment of hope that even the loneliest hearts could be touched by connection. Winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the prairie. The snow melted in patches under the pale sunlight, revealing the brown earth beneath, a promise of spring and renewal. For Eli Harper, the lonely rancher, the changing season mirrored the transformation taking place in his life. The walls he had built around himself over decades of isolation had begun to crumble, replaced by trust, connection, and a quiet but powerful sense of belonging. Eli had become more than a silent protector. He now participated in the Miller family's daily life, not as an intruder, but as a trusted presence. In the mornings, he helped Clara with chores, mending fences, gathering firewood, and preparing small gardens for the coming thaw. His hands, once only hardened by labor and solitude, now carried a warmth and gentleness he hadn't allowed himself to show in years. Clara watched him quietly, grateful for his help, but even more for the steady calm he brought to their home. Samuel thrived under Eli's guidance. Each day, the boy learned a little more about the ranch, the land, and the rhythms of nature. He became confident and capable, his small hands gaining skill under Eli's careful instruction. More importantly, he learned what trust meant, the courage to rely on someone else and the understanding that kindness could be steadfast, even in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. Lily followed suit, her initial shyness replaced with curiosity and a sense of security she had never known. Together, the children became a source of joy, laughter, and purpose in Eli's life. Eli also found himself sharing more than just practical skills. He told stories of the prairie, of the animals and the seasons, of lessons learned from hardship and solitude. The children listened, wide-eyed, absorbing not only the knowledge but the unspoken wisdom that life was not only about survival, but about care, courage, and the bonds we forge along the way. In turn, the children taught Eli things he had forgotten: how to laugh without caution, how to celebrate small victories, and how to find warmth not just in a fire, but in human connection. The community began to notice the change in Eli Harper. The once distant rancher, who had avoided townsfolk and shunned company, now engaged quietly with neighbors, offering help when needed and sharing resources during harsh times. Though he remained reserved, there was a lightness in his presence, a subtle humility, and a calm confidence that spoke of a man reconciled with his past and willing to embrace the present. One evening, after a day of work, Eli, Clara, Samuel, and Lily sat together by the fire, sharing a modest meal. The children laughed at a small story Eli recounted about Rust, the horse, and the playful mischief of cattle. Clara smiled at the sight, her heart full, knowing that the once lonely man had become an irreplaceable part of their lives. In that moment, the house was no longer just a shelter, it was a home, alive with warmth, trust, and mutual care. Eli realized that life had offered him a rare gift, the chance to reconnect, to experience companionship, and to be part of something larger than himself. The family had changed him as much as he had helped them. His solitude was no longer a shield but a choice, balanced by the relationships he now cherished. The boy's plea, spoken so bravely weeks ago, had set in motion a series of events that transformed not just a family's survival, but a man's heart. As night fell, Eli looked out over the prairie. The land stretched endlessly, yet it no longer symbolized isolation. It was a place of work, of beauty, and of connection, a land shared with those he had come to care for. Samuel and Lily's laughter drifted from the cabin, Clara humming softly while tidying the hearth. And Eli Harper, the lonely rancher no more, felt a profound sense of peace. He had found purpose, companionship, and redemption. Winter had tested them all, but through courage, trust, and compassion, a new beginning had been forged. Eli Harper had learned that life, though unpredictable and often harsh, could also be full of warmth, love, and connection. The lonely rancher had discovered not only the strength to care, but the joy of being cared for in return. And in that discovery, he had found the home and the heart that he had long sought without even realizing it.